So we now have a playable game, but we're going to enhance the game a little bit by adding a few things, or changing a few things. First, we're going to change the player's hits so that there are more hits for the player and they then can stay alive for longer and have more leeway a little bit. So I think that'll make it a little more fun. 2 is we're going to make the groups of enemies appear at random times, and it'll be a random time between when each group of enemies appears. And then finally, we're going to only have the enemies shoot when the player is in front of them. And so we'll go kind of over those as we do each one. So we're going to start with the player. It's probably the easiest one we're going to do today. We're going to change the player's hits to 10 instead. So I'm going to go to the create event of the player, and I'm going to change the hits to 10. Now, just doing that will change the hits to 10, but we won't see the effects of it on the health bar unless we fix how the health bar is being drawn. Because when we draw the health bar, our value should just go up to 100. And because our old value was 5 hits, we had hits times 20 for the value of the current value of the health bar. Instead, we're going to make it hits times 10, because now that we have 10 hits, to get to 100, it would be multiplied by 10. And so that it'll cause our health bar to look like we're going down by 10 each time. With the enemies, we're going to make the enemies appear with random intervals in between. I'm going to go to the control object. We're going to be in the create event. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to give a little bit more time for the first group to show up. So I'm going to change it from 1 second, which is 30, to 4 seconds, which is 120. That way there's a little more time for the player to kind of get ready to go. Then we're going to go into the alarm 0 event, and we're going to change how often or how long the control object waits until it sends the new group of enemies. We already have a randomize block here, so that we don't need to change that. All we need to do is add a get random number here. And what we're going to do is we're going to choose between 2 and 6 seconds. So we're going to get a random number between those two. So I'm going to choose an integer between 2 and 6 seconds. And we're going to call this wait. It'll be a temporary variable because we're using it just long enough to set the alarm countdown, and then once the alarm goes off again, we don't need it anymore. To set the alarm countdown, though, instead of 180, we're going to set it to 30 times wait. Wait was a value we were thinking of in seconds, and then for the alarm countdown, we need to translate seconds to steps. In order to do that, we multiply by 30, because there are 30 steps happening a second. So now, when we run it, we should have enemies appearing at random intervals from anywhere from 2 to 6 seconds. And we should also notice that our player is going to have more life, essentially. Well, it does have more life. So now, the only other thing that we need to do is we need to fix how the enemies are shooting, because they shouldn't really be shooting at the player. Well, they shouldn't be shooting if the player's not near them, because that doesn't make any sense. So we're going to fix that part of this. But we see that enemies are appearing at various times. It's not always the same interval between. And we can change that interval, of course, by changing the random numbers we choose from, we're going to leave it for now, just make sure it works. Now I'm going to go to the enemy, and we're going to go through how we're going to make the enemy fire when the player is in front of them. And it's important to understand what it means to be in front of another person, or what we're going to define as when the player is in front of the enemy. So the player and the enemy both have bounding boxes around them. Those bounding boxes have a right and a left side, because we're going to be focusing on the right and the left. We could say that in front is when their left and right bounding boxes line up, right? If the left and the right values of the bounding box line up, that is directly in front. That is, unfortunately, one, might not happen. Two, it's a very limited definition of in front. That is directly in front. That is like, it's got to be perfect, so it might not even happen. And it's very limited. There's only one case where that's true. Instead of that, we're going to say that any time that any part of the player is in front of any part of the enemy, we're going to call it in front of and allow the enemy to fire. What that means in a practical sense and what we're doing is, with the bounding box values, the left and right values for both the player and the enemy, the left-hand value, the left-hand bounding box for the player has to be less than the right-hand bounding box for the enemy. So if you can envision it, the right-hand side of the enemy is just barely across the left-hand side of the player. And if that's true, and as long as the other side, the right-hand side, is greater than the left-hand side of the left, or the left-hand side is to the right, so the right-hand side of the player is to the right of the enemy, that will also be in front. Because if we just left it at that, just the left, the player's left is to the left of the right-hand side of the enemy, if we keep going to the left, the enemy would still shoot. So we have to stop shooting if the player's all the way past the enemy on the left or on the right. So this should work both ways. So we're gonna check on those bounding box values. We're gonna compare them, and then we're going to, if both those things are true, the player's left is to the left of the enemy's right, and the player's right is to the right of the enemy's left. If both those things are true, we're going to allow the enemy to fire. If they're not true, then we're not going to fire. It's that simple. So in order to do this, we have to set up some things. One of those is a flag that we're going to have in the enemy. So we're going to go to the create event, and we're going to add a variable, and this variable is going to be our flag. It's going to be called fire, because it's going to tell the enemy whether or not they can fire. And we're going to set it to false to begin with, because we're going to assume that the enemy is not going to be lined up with the player. But we can always change, like that can always change as soon as the enemy appears, and they can then check and see, are they in front of the player, and then they can start shooting if they are. So that's one thing. So basically, we're going to check in the step event. We're going to constantly check where the bounding boxes for both the player and the enemy are. Okay, so in the step event, we're going to go above where we check the hits for the enemy. We're going to we need to get two instance variables from the enemy. So we're going to add two get instance variable blocks. We need the bounding box left and the bounding box right. We're going to call this one enemy left, and we're going to make it temporary. We're going to call this one enemy right and also make it temporary. Okay, so that gives us the left and the right value, bounding box values for the enemy themselves. Now we need to get the same values for the player. We could just put two get instance variable blocks, click on the little arrow, change what object they apply to, and we would do that. I want to show you something else though that can be useful if you have a lot of stuff that you want to run for one object that's not the object you're currently in. So we're going to use this apply to block. So the apply to block is so you can run a bunch of code in another object when you're not in that object currently. So right now we're in the enemy object. I want to run a couple of lines of code in the player object. So I'm going to add the apply to. I'm going to click the down arrow and I'm going to choose the obj player object. I know there's only one obj player object, so I'm not too worried about that. Then I'm going to add my two get instance variables, and like anything else that I can put stuff inside of, I start with the first one on the right of the apply to, and then the other one I can put it right underneath that, and they scoot over, they indent a little bit to show that they're inside of that container. And then I'm going to change each one to a bounding box left and a bounding box right. I don't need to change those because I know they're already applying to the obj player. This one is going to be called player left, and it's going to be a temporary variable. And this one's going to be player right, and a temporary variable. So now we have all those values stored in some temporary variables. Enemy left, enemy right, player left, player right. And we're going to check to see if the player's left is less than the enemy's right, and if the player's right is greater than the enemy's left. Now we could do this with a couple of if variable statements, but there's a more efficient way to do it in using expressions. So I'm going to add an if expression right above the if variable here. If expression allows you to just type one of the expressions that we would normally use. And then I can add multiple expressions to check if they're all true before I run something. That's what we want to do. We want to check, is the player's left less than the enemy's right? And, so I'm going to click the plus. We're going to check if the player's right is greater than the enemy's left. And if both those are true, then like any if statement, it's going to run code that I want it to run. In this case, all we're going to do is we are going to assign the fire variable the value of true. Flip the flag. But if this isn't true, we don't want to fire. And if we're currently firing, we don't want to continue firing, we want to stop firing. So in order to do that, I need the else. So I'm adding the else underneath the if expression. And then inside of there, I'm adding an assign variable. And this time, the fire variable is going to turn to false. So we've got the flag in place. But until we fix what's going on in the alarm 0, which is where the actual firing of the lasers is happening, this won't affect how the enemies are actually firing. Because in here, it just basically we shoot a laser and then we wait another 2 seconds and shoot another laser and so on. So we only want to shoot lasers when the fire variable is true. Okay, so we want to do if variable, the variable is fire, we're going to leave it as equal to, and we're going to say true. And then I'm going to take both of the laser, both the create instances for the lasers, and put those inside the if variable, so that those will only appear when the fire variable is true. I'm going to leave the set alarm countdown out there. Now here's the deal. The reason why I'm doing this is because, well, the reason why we used the alarm in the first place was to allow the enemy to continuously shoot, but also so it wasn't a continuous stream of shooting, or a continuous stream of lasers. It was like shot, wait, and so on and so forth. We still want to have that built-in wait time. We're just going to cut down the wait time. That as long as the player's in front of us, if it's been a second since we last shot, we can shoot again. And so I'm going to change both the alarm countdowns to 30. But you'll see what that looks like when we actually run it now. And that's what we're going to do. So we're going to actually run it and see if this works. So I'm going to let one group pass by to show you that it's not going to shoot unless I'm in front of them. So notice none of those guys are shooting. Now when I go over here, these guys, as soon as I get in front of them, start shooting. And you would think, oh, well, all those, with only a second in between, it must be like really, really quick, but it's not. As it turns out, it's not that bad, actually. And so now it really feels more like a game. Feels like you can actually control. Feels like you're not having to dance in between a bunch of things that you can't make. And we get this error because our player object no longer exists after it was destroyed by the enemies. So, and we'll deal with lies later on. But for now, we've got this done, so we're good to go with this.